Good evening, honoured guests, those who are joining us here, and also those who are joining us online. It is indeed a great honour and special privilege for me to welcome you to the UJ Professional Inaugural Lecture of Prof. Patrick Brand. And I emphasize the UJ one because he's had his initial professorial inaugural many moons away, I would assume, Prof. Bond. But we still like when we have new professors at UJ that they also do a lecture for us at UJ so that we can hear you professing and hear what you've done before and what we are looking forward to. So as I wish you all a warm word of welcome, I want to emphasize any special guests who are here and colleagues. And this is indeed a proud, joyful and landmark moment for all of us here at UJ, but also for higher education in general in South Africa and beyond, because such inaugural lectures are always very special. The inauguration of professors in a public ceremony in which newly appointed professors, and in this case newly appointed at UJ, are inducted into the office by the Vice-Chancellor and deliver the inaugural address. The ceremony has its root in the medieval university and serves multiple purposes. First, it is an expression of welcome into the circle of colleagues who are already professors, and in this case, it's professors at UJ specifically. Secondly, it provides a platform for professors to display their expertise in the discipline and showcase their research, to profess, and that's what we're looking forward to hearing Prof. Bond professing tonight. In many traditions, and it's subscribed to by many universities, assuming the role of the professor refers to the gown and the cap. Once we have listened to the inaugural address, the gown, denoting the professorship, will formally be assumed. And then you will see us dressing or gowning Professor Bond. Today we gather to witness Professor Bond's entry into the illustrious community of scholars at our university. It celebrates his contributions to the discipline and ultimately his impact on society. Professors provide a university with its identity, character, academic legitimacy, and integrity. The inaugural lecture is a rite of passage following the confirmation of the appointed person as a professor, and as I indicated in this case, a professor at UJ. This evening, we will listen to Professor Bond as, and I like this expression, the gown goes to town. By this, we mean that the power of the inaugural address is when the expertise is showcased beyond the corridors of the university and reverberates with society. And aren't we privileged that we nowadays can live stream such an inaugural lecture, and many people can listen to it. And it's indeed the case that the gown goes to town, but also virtually in this case. In the past, several philosophers and scholars have defined universities using very narrow conceptualizations. For example, universities are there to search for truth, to produce universal knowledge, and even sometimes as instruments serving the purpose of the economy or being utilitarian in nature. Through our work and research at UJ, we hope that we can break out of these narrow conceptualizations and reflect on the university as contributing to the public good, working towards societal impact. What is the role of the intellectual? Edward Said, in one of his articles, defines the role of the intellectual as one who commands a vast knowledge of a specific discipline, one who is rigorous in an analysis of literature, who views being an intellectual as a vocation, and who functions as a kind of public memory to recall what is forgotten or ignored, to make the connections that are otherwise hidden, and to provide alternatives for mistaken policies. This is, to my mind, an appropriate depiction of what it means to be a professor. And I'm sure Prof. Bond would be able to add much more. This evening, we listen to Professor Bond as one further step in the journey of being a professor at UJ. This inaugural lecture creates an opportunity for Prof. Bond to do a self-reflective pause and taking us into his thinking while he's doing the self-reflective pause, and take us on his journey as a professor, ongoing journey as a professor here at UJ. Let me now invite the Executive Dean, Prof. Kamala Naidu, to introduce Professor Patrick Bond.
Good evening. Sunny Banani, Dumelang, Goeiemorgen, Goeienaand. I'd like to welcome you all. I acknowledge DVC Prof. Gravett, Prof. Patrick Bond, discussant Professor Samantha Ashman, guests and colleagues within the venue and online. It is indeed a great pleasure to be here today at the inaugural lecture of Professor Patrick Bond. I'm going to read a synopsis of his biography and hope that this does justice to his incredibly dynamic legacy. Patrick Bond currently serves as Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Director of the Center for Social Change. His origins are both Irish and British, from a birthplace in religiously divided Belfast. His formative years were in the United States, specifically Alabama, during the Civil Rights Movement. His mother, now resident there, was a social worker in an African-American orphanage, and his late father worked with NASA on developing the moon rockets built in that state's 3IR oasis of Huntsville. Patrick spent the 1980s mainly in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C., where he learned politics in the student anti-apartheid solidarity movement, especially once he visited Durban in 1984 and was radicalized by the Natal Indian Congress youth in 1984, including at the Phoenix ashram of Mahatma Gandhi, where Praveen Gordon ran teach-ins. And like students now raising Gaza encampments at US campuses, Patrick and thousands in his generation built shanty towns demanding divestment of university endowment funds profiting from apartheid. Always on the US scene then were sociologist Fatima Mir and the tireless poet and campaigner Dennis Brutus, South Africa's best-known anti-apartheid cultural worker who taught in Chicago and Pittsburgh while in exile, and with whom Patrick worked closely until 2009 when Brutus passed on. And just over 6 months from now, November 28, is a Brutus birth centenary. So we look forward to commemoration events here and across the world to be announced soon. Patrick moved to Johannesburg in early 1990. After a year of doctoral fieldwork in Zimbabwe, under the supervision of leading Marxist scholar David Harvey, then splitting time between Johns Hopkins and Oxford. Patrick's earlier studies were in economics at Swarthmore College and at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School of Finance. There, Patrick studied with Edward S. Herman, best known as Noam Chomsky's co-author of Manufacturing Consent, about US interference in other countries' politics. In 1990, he moved here to do research on urban transformation in the Yeovil NGO Plan Act, assisting dozens of township civic associations. This connected him to Moses Mzwanele Maekiso, whose South African National Civic Organization mandated Patrick to co-edit the Reconstruction and Development Program in 1994. That was followed by authorship of a dozen green and white papers for the democratic state, including the white paper on reconstruction and development, while serving in Minister J. Naidu's RDP office within the Mandela presidency. Before joining UJ in 2021, Patrick held professorships at UWC, WITS, UKZN, and the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, where he was also a sovereign debt researcher based in Haitian President Jean-Bertrand Aristide's Washington office in 1995. He directed UKZN's Center for Civil Society from 2004 to 2016, where he learned much more about social resistance to oppression, including post-apartheid access to AIDS medicines, environmental justice movements, and unfulfilled rights to housing, water and sanitation, electricity, and free higher education. Over the past 2 decades, he has lectured at more than 100 universities, including the Islamic University of Gaza and Bezait, where he advised on the establishment of their social science doctoral program. His publications include the most cited work in South African social science, Elite Transition from Apartheid to Neoliberalism, and several books on international political economy, climate change, and BRICS, where he has explored the subject of the sub-imperial location in which Western corporate power assimilates even those with profound grievances and sound critiques. Patrick will tell us that it is a combination of the bottom-up, top-down, and scholarly perspectives he has garnered over the years that can be usefully fused when addressing his topic tonight, extreme, uneven development. But this can be true only if we, like Patrick, learn from successful South Africans who have in various campaigns, even momentarily, challenged the power of racism, patriarchy, ecocide, imperialism, and capitalism. With this introduction, I invite Professor Patrick Bond to address us. Thank you very much.
Well, it is a great honor. My voice is slightly crackly. Is it the winter dryness beginning? Not yet, but I'm grateful that you're going to be able to work with me through 40 minutes. And of course, I'm very grateful, Sarah and Camilla, for your hospitality, and to Sam, who's going to do some brilliant commentary. She's really our guru in many of the things I'll be describing. For me, it's also a chance to thank so many of the colleagues here. So many of you have taught me so much, and you've given me moral and emotional support. And I'm really, really happy that a year and a half ago, I was able to join UJ, and I'll be here forever. 34 years ago, I moved to Johannesburg from Harare. And before that, as you heard, on the East Coast. What a contradictory city. What an incredible country that has the, I think, deserved reputation in the original fields I know best, political economy and political ecology, as a very extreme place to be. So the book that's about ready to go to press with Palgrave Macmillan will be summed up in the next 37 minutes in 5 chunks, if that's appropriate. The contested definitions of the idea, uneven development. We will start with Trotsky in 1905 and my first mentor, Neil Smith. There's some vignettes that I think might be helpful. I'll introduce you to 2 topics you probably have heard of, carbon markets, privatizing the air, and the way predatory microfinance operates through machinistas, but not just any machinistas, one that the World Bank has given strong support and finance to, and you'll see the story unfold from the local to the global in the way so many of our contradictions and our extreme uneven development experiences do. Sajida Khan, the late activist, sort of community environmental justice leader in Clare Estate in Durban, and Hilda Nkantini, and through Hilda, Black Sash, give me both tragedy and a sense of potential power. And that allows me to go back to race-class debates that in sociology put South Africa onto the world map. And we have some theoretical reflections about how uneven development might assist. Some empirical material, it's mostly in the paper, it'll otherwise perhaps be overwhelming, because it addresses the underlying dilemma of those wanting to manage uneven development and manage capitalist crises, which is that capital tends to overproduce. This is Marx's Das Kapital central contradiction, isn't it? The overaccumulation tendency, of course, along with the class struggle. But the overaccumulation problem is so severe that even this week, Xi Jinping was in Paris and getting told off by Macron and von der Leyen from the EU. And he denied this overaccumulation. So we have to have a quick look at what's at stake there. Because uneven development at the global scale is getting worse and worse. And I'm convinced that some of this really does have to do not simply with geopolitical fissures like Russia's invasion of Ukraine or the genocide in Gaza, but we do get, for the last moment or two, a little hint at some of the resistance possibilities described in more detail in the paper, including areas where, like my friend Trevor Ngwani continually teaches me, social resistance network possibilities, when flippantly I might use a term like popcorn protests that pop up and fall down too quickly. Now, we'll go over that after a couple of beers at the end of the day, maybe. I will just end, though, with the most inspiring experience, which is watching the way the Treatment Action Campaign negated uneven development of access to vital, life-saving AIDS medicines. The original framing that I was exposed to when I was starting my graduate program had come from Neil Smith, who passed away a dozen years ago. And he was a student at the time at Johns Hopkins of David Harvey. And David continues to put extraordinary work out. Every couple of weeks, his podcast comes out. And last Friday at the City University of New York Center for Place, Culture and Politics, he was holding forth on how Neil and he put this project together. Very inspiring. Neil at the time had been a devotee of this man, Leon Trotsky. And there is something in the 1905 permanent revolution argument about uneven and combined development, which David and I, unlike Neil, didn't think was the right way to pose the problem. For Trotsky, a simple framing of this, that the universal law of unevenness in capitalism, that is, more development in some and more poverty in others, not because there are two economies, but because it's a central process. But you have a combinedness which draws together different stages of the journey of an amalgam of archaic with more contemporary forms. So he was thinking about how in Russia in 1905 there could be a revolutionary step without having to go from that largely feudal and czar-ruled society through industrial capitalism. And that theory has motivated just the flippant, sort of sentence or two, a very important school in international relations, uneven and combined development, largely because of Justin Rosenberg's team at Sussex University. And likewise, another version of uneven and combined development comes from a political analysis by the Brazilian, based in Paris, Michael Lowy, who applies it to politics, but more recently to the challenge of eco-socialism, because his latest work on the theory describes how the expansion of capital and the destruction of the environment are combined and inseparable, and a struggle to save the climate has to become anti-capitalist combat, otherwise doomed to failure. Now, I want to come back to that because it's one of the vignettes as to what a capitalist would do, and does do, to privatize the air to save the planet. Now, several of us, and our dear colleague Ashwin Desai, the chair of social change here, and myself began to work on how this uneven and combined might work in looking at the traditional problems of South African sociologists grappling with the race-class debate. And thank goodness, on another sphere coming out of economics, Sam and Ben Fine, probably the most prolific and important political economist who's worked in South Africa, and Susan Newman also began to explore, and indeed just last year, Sam's article adding racial capitalism, a crucial theoretical frame that really comes to the world from Martin Legassick and Dave Hempson, two sociologists, historians, who wrote in 1976, as they were trying to contest with the ANC how to do sanctions. And they, as our dear comrades in the Palestine Solidarity Movement know, they wanted to figure out whether the, let's say, attack on the dominant form of capitalism and racism should happen together, or unlike the majority of sort of the ANC and Communist Party, they should be two stages. And that racial capitalism now is being, through many great thinkers that are working around the world, the late Stuart Hall. There's a big group in Israel that thinks through, in Palestine that thinks through Israeli settler colonialism, how the racial capitalist approach helps. That is, that capitalism needs racism. And my approach to that, I'll show you in a moment, comes from Ben Magubani's historicization. And we have another contributor, Sanen Baran, who's a Turkish scholar working now on whether uneven and combined development is amplified by the BRICS, which he says is the case. Now, in my own work, the BRICS loom large at the moment, and particularly because last August, as we hosted them, we did a counter summit for civil society here at UJ. But we have quite a few works that try to explore what sub-imperial locations might be in uneven global development of capitalism. So I'll come back to that at some point. What's the original definition that we felt would be helpful? Well, with Trevor here, with Ashwin, uneven development means that extremely different relations of production coexist within and across territory. So South Africa is the extreme example, with a circuit of luxury consumption and new technologies, but others is the ex-Bantustan rural areas continuing their decline. And what the Harvey and Smith tradition allows us to trace flows of capital to sites where there's higher profits, and that flow doesn't, let's say, equilibrate, it doesn't establish even development as capital finds a higher rate of return, as standard economic theory would suggest. But on the contrary, it tends to work in a political ecological way with social reproduction to exacerbate the differentials and to enhance the inequality. So we're just kind of wrapping up our let's say, definitional problems, and these have motivated me to write about uneven development in these books. I think the other critical point that Dani Nabuderi, Ugandan, explored in his book, The Crash of International Finance Capital, is how when capital overaccumulates, this sort of phenomenon of a delinking of the financial assets from their real base, so a financial speculative bubbling occurs. So that's a systematic way from volume 3 of Das Kapital to think about financialization. Now, from Neil, the extent to which unevenness or structured inequalities could be identified ranged across society, different sectors of an economy, manufacturing and finance and agriculture and mining and so forth. And space. These are geographers, after all. That was my PhD. I minored in development sociology at Johns Hopkins. But spatial relations, you'll see, are very important to the way this argument plays out. So to scale, jumping scale from the body, the household and gender relations through municipalities and regions and nationalities and continents and the global, and sustainability and the socio-ecological relations. We do get a great deal from Smith's book, Uneven Development, his PhD, and it is celebrated as sort of the major work in this field. When David did a foreword to the final edition that came out, he used a couple of exciting examples for me when I read them that I'd like to think about with you. The extension of market logics and of private property arrangements lead, well, he gives examples, ridiculously inefficient as well as inegalitarian carbon trading schemes and microcredit institutions that shamelessly prey on the poor. These were sort of on his mind and thinking about unevenness. Well, we're pretty extreme, but the world needs some sort of extreme solution. And this is, after all, Nicholas Stern, the great British economist, former World Bank chief economist, says, the greatest market failure the world has seen. And the solutions from that end of the spectrum are broadly twofold. Technological fixes, carbon capture and storage and sequestration, of carbon through genetically modified trees, or putting iron ore into the ocean to create algae blooms that will pick up the carbon and sink, or any number of other strategies, nuclear and many other techie approaches to CO2 emissions. And also to trade in emissions, so that the most efficient can compete the least efficient, because the least efficient will have to pay more to be able to pollute. The polluter pays, in a sense, which is something we'd all want to see happening. Finally, I'll show you why it's not. But to do it in the market, not as a fine and then a ban, but to say you can pay to pollute. You can keep polluting. We're going to privatize the air and sell the right to pollute. It turns out, for our extremes, South Africa hosted the first in Africa of these carbon market strategies, called a clean development mechanism. It was in a place where I used to throw my rubbish, or eventually it got there, Bosasa Road in Clare Estate in Durban. And this is the ridiculously inefficient and inegalitarian carbon market at work. So you can see, some of you who know Durban, it's fairly central. I think it's not too far, Camilla, from where you were raised. And so it's a very important area, because it is the largest formal landfill in Africa. And it was the pilot to take what you see there is sort of a, let's just pull it back here, the basically a methane generation site where energy could be created through turbines that were run from pipes that go all through this landfill and suck out the methane. And next to it is a very famous part of Durban, where the group called Abishlali Basam Jindolo, the radical shack settlement network, actually started in Kennedy Road. And not too far away, at the other side, Clare Estate's most important kind of Erin Brockovich. I don't want to use U.S. cultural icons, but I mean, there are a lot of parallels to what Sajida Khan was able to do. But she passed in 2007 after 2 bouts of cancer that came from that very dump, because they were burning hospital waste. The incineration there was appalling. She was on the front page of the Washington Post as carbon markets were introduced in 2005. You may remember something called the Kyoto Protocol. It was to privatize the air, and although NGOs weren't involved, Al Gore, the then US Vice President in 1997, said, look, if you don't let my companies continue to pollute and let them buy the right to pollute, we're not going to be part of your UNFCCC, the big UN Framework Convention on Climate Change annual summit. So they put this in, and 2005 it kicks in. And I think the way Sajida put it to the Post reporter, the project sponsors at the World Bank call it a win-win situation. Sajida Khan calls it a disaster. She said her community's suffering is being prolonged so that a rich country will not have to make difficult cuts in greenhouse gas emissions at home. It's another form of colonialism. And she was referring to the campaign that she and thousands of the Clare Estate residents had been they were campaigning to close that dump completely. And the point about the World Bank getting involved was, by marketing this, you could then say to the eThekwini municipality, to the very, let's say, ambitious city manager, Mike Sutcliffe, well, keep the dump open, keep polluting, we'll suck it in, we'll be able to charge emitters in the north, and then they'll offset their emissions through our reduction by having sucked out some of that carbon. And it was expensive, 126 million in capital, 13 million a year for about 15 years for running it. And it was being run financially through the World Bank. Now, the World Bank does something interesting you'll be curious about. Well, what is going on with this privatization of the air? Something you hear about vaguely, right? Carbon markets, they'll save us. It's not going very well. You can see that only about 20% of the world's emissions are covered by different kinds of pricing, taxes and emissions trading schemes and offsets. Now, in the crucial questions, well, how much do you pay if you want to make your ton? So I fly, for example, to, where was it? Portland, Oregon, a couple of tons last month. That's 2 tons that I should pay for to offset if I accept this logic. And South Africa doesn't charge me very much. Here's the South African Revenue Service. It's only 6 rand for the 2 big ones, Eskom and Sasol. 6 rand per ton, which is, let's do sort of a correlation to the rest of the world. 30 cents per ton. Phew, that's nothing. I don't have to pay for that. I mean, my airlines just laugh at that. Sweden pays $132. What should it be? The researchers I look at carefully in University College London have said that if you update the model of costing the damage done by my flying to Portland, Oregon last month, it should be $3,000 a ton. Well, then I wouldn't have gone. And that's the sort of attempt to say the market can change behavior if the elasticity kicks in. Now, we're just nowhere near it, but look at the major carbon market to say this isn't just about being inadequate, it is ridiculously inefficient. And for that reason, this very, very low price from the beginning in 2005 right through 2018, when the South Sea Road was selling the carbon market to the world, the price was only 30 cents per ton in this clean development mechanism. So it didn't work. Don't take it from me. GTZ, the Germans, SALGA, the South African Local Government Association, they've all acknowledged that this wasn't the right way to go with all of that methane. The worst thing is when you start to get more regulation and try to make this price more effective, then you start getting into markets where huge amounts of money is flooding around through quantitative easing, financial markets. So the financialization of all our economies have shot this price up very high, over 100 euros a ton. But wait a minute, you can see it keeps crashing. This is the volatility, the ridiculously inefficient use of markets. Let's say even worse, markets controlled by financiers when they can't even control their own financial markets. And then the crash in just the last year from 105 euros just to 55 euros. Now, what Sajida did was invite extraordinary people from around the world for the Durban Group for Climate Justice. I certainly was a parasite sufficiently inspired by her struggle against this. And she predicted more or less all these things that we've been talking about to write some books about it. Can I go to a second vignette quickly? Because I hope I've drawn you into how South Africans play with dialectic. She didn't win. She passed from cancer. But the knowledge that she is producing in this struggle motivated a great many of us, this Durban Group for Climate Justice and many others, saying, don't privatize the air as a solution. It's not going to work. Here's somebody who said, I'm not going to do what the salesman wants. And the salesman's very important. His name is AJ Banga. And her name is Hilda Nkantini. She lives not too far from here in the Elias Matsoleri shack settlement. And just 11 years ago, this man, AJ Banga, who was the CEO of MasterCard, visited her with his team. I get these pictures you see here from Flickr. They're very proud. She was their poster child. Because she was getting something very valuable from him that she appreciated, a card. She didn't have to wait in a long queue to get her pension payout, and she didn't have to walk around with the money, and the Tutsis were all around. So this was an extraordinary advance of technology, a fourth industrial revolution of fintech, right, that she embraced partially, but that's the crucial point. And AJ Banga did a great job when he was here, January 2013. You can see all the highfalutin people he was meeting with. But he made a mistake, and the mistake is right there. His name's Serge Bellamont, because Serge Bellamont ran a company, Net1, and it had a subsidiary to manage all of the social grant payouts. And those are called cash paymaster services. And they went to 17 million people. This is, within 4 years, Serge Bellamont's reputation of wrecking poor people's finances by taking the grant and making it collateral, like every month you get the grant. So now we can put debt on you. And then when you have debt, microfinance, a burial society contract, even a cell phone contract, then we're going to start putting the debit orders. And then you have nothing left in your grant. Now, a group was inspired by the kind of problems Hilda Nkantini and her friends were experiencing with this payout. And that group is Black Sash. And you'll all remember that a white liberal woman would wear the black sash and go out and just wander around Joburg and Cape Town and Durban. They had moved, though, by that time, from being against apartheid on this racial basis as white liberal women. More power to them. They'd now become black working class women. And they started campaigns saying, stop the debt trap. Social grants are for food and basic needs, not 6-year-olds getting microfinance contracts, right? So this predatory finance had moved in and gone way too far. And that was even recognized not by Batabile Dlamini, although by her DG, whose name was Zain Dangor. We miss seeing him today, but we have such respect for him. But Zain actually quit. as the DG for Batubili Dlamini, who said, CPS, let's just run everything through them. Now, that meant in September 2020, in the midst of our big first COVID wave, that CPS was taken to the courts by Black Sash and taken into bankruptcy. Wow. And the key person who didn't learn anything from this is named A.J. Banga. And 3 years later, he was named president of the World Bank. Now, he's got a very important role. You see the G20, right? The 20 big powers meeting in Delhi last September. And a whole lot of what's going to happen when we host the G20 next year. Lula da Silva, the Brazilian leader, hosts it in November in Rio. And then the US hosts it after. You can see the sort of lineup there. Is development finance. And fintech is so crucial. And that's why this man, A.J. Banga, has gone so far. Now, we've tried to raise the alarm. 3 of my colleagues are amongst the world experts on microfinance, Milford Bateman and Lina Levinas. Lina is from Brazil, and she does the critique of the financialization of poverty, looking especially at the Brazilian version of this, the Bolsa Familia. And then a very strong young geographer out of UWC, Erin Torkelson, who did her PhD and was a researcher. And then we find that actually there's a real bias built into this, the financialization of predatory microfinance, because the World Bank actually owned 22%, the biggest single chunk of Net One, of Serge Balamant's company. Now, you kind of think, well, the World Bank must recognize this didn't go well, right? They had to be taken to bankruptcy, and they'd ruined so many lives with this predatory financing. They didn't. They said, this is fine. It says, strengthen financial stability and increase access to finance for the poor. This is the objective. And then they say, basically, that everything's going okay. Objectives mostly achieved. I know this not because I can get deep into Hilda Incantini's books, but actually we have a very dear colleague who Trevor recruited for me for this job, Sipiwe Mbata from our Center for Social Change. And he went, and without any knowledge of even her last name, she was just Hilda on the Flickr account. 10 years later, now 87, she was identified living here, still in the same place. I think you all know Barra because on the one side is Chris Hani Barra, but also we have this wonderful UJ campus. And if you delve deep and you see the conditions Hilda's living in, well, they're not changed from the worst housing, water with padlocked taps, terrible forms of sanitation that haven't been connected to any sewer system, the electricity you can imagine, and the rubbish removal doesn't really exist, and the local economy is just really very informal activity for spaza-type shops. Now, that just suggests to me this microfinance that he was so excited to test out with Hilda Incantini hasn't gone anywhere. And this is proven again and again, even with Muhammad Yunus financializing the solution to poverty. It leads us to ask, what are these systems that produce extreme uneven development that makes Johannesburg the world's most unequal city, Cape Town number 5, Lagos number 2. And then if you scan the property prices in our cities, within South Africa, this kind of unbelievably high, let's say, peaks of real estate, basically housing and medium suburban property value. I mean, the East Coast with the Atlantic seaboard and George and all are pretty high too, but Sandton really stands out, especially Sandhurst. This isn't just in terms of the income levels, the extreme property, but more generally wealth. It's only Russia that for a while took over South Africa as the most unequal for the holdings of wealth. 35,000 adults have this vast majority of wealth. And they declined, interestingly, when our stock market crashed, 3 times, 98, 2001, 2008. There may be some offshoring of wealth because, as I'll show you, we're really losing a vast amount of our capital to illicit financial flows and unethical activity. And we see this now if we think about the regional inequality, because our country is number 1, and just around us, Namibia, Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho are also in the top 7 or 8. One of the reasons is migrant labor systems that extract from women that is a social reproduction subsidy, so that if you're sick, as these indications of mine-related illnesses like tuberculosis, silicosis, asbestosis, we should put HIV as well, and that's very, very high for migrancy. And that means that the cost of social reproduction, let's say, of getting a worker back to health so they can go back into the job, or raising a young worker as a child, or raising or maintaining an older worker who gets a very weak pension, if at all, is borne by women. So the race, class, and then gendered and ecological features all come together. This was well known, if I return from these vignettes to some of the theoretical inspirations, by a woman who lived in mostly Berlin at the time in Poland, where she was from, Rosa Luxemburg. And she really brought Das Kapital, which she knew intimately from studying Marx and being a leading socialist in Germany, into, let's say, engagement with the South African research that had been published by John Hobson, a great book, Imperialism, of course by locals like Olive Schreiner, like Sol Plaatje. And so she could draw on these primary accounts of super-exploitation, as I just mentioned, this migrant labor being so vital. But then she also said there's also natural resource grabbing. And that, of course, when you have this city having half the world's gold at its peak, really explains most of our extreme uneven development just from, economists call it, natural capital depletion. So for Luxemburg, the way to understand this was capitalism needs non-capitalist relations, like nature or women in local community management or male tribal orders. It needs to go in and, as she put it, eat up the non-capitalist. So she has a great work called The Accumulation of Capital, 1913. And David Harvey realized in 2001, as he was writing the new Imperialism, that this hinged on something that Marx had identified. You've probably heard this term, primitive accumulation, which is before capitalism starts. The wealthy have to accumulate. They have to throw British peasants off the land to have enclosures and therefore grab the land, and then they have enough to start industrial production. And there's plenty of different versions of it, including usury in the national debt, so financial predation. For David Harvey, trying to map the flows of capital, it became important now, only in the 2000s, I mean, well into his career and his really rich understanding of flows of capital, to start to say, okay, it's not just the flows that go from capital and labor, where you have surplus value extraction. We've got to do social reproduction and nature as part and parcel. Nancy Fraser was doing much the same at the time, so they live close together. I don't know if they've talked enough, but on our side, when we add race, we've got some extremely important parts of this story, just to remind you of, which are racial capitalism created through this uneven development process of capital accumulation, but in waves and stages, historical periods where Ben Magubani, probably South Africa's greatest sociologist, much of his career in exile, talked about accumulation by dispossession, extermination, and occupation as one stage, by slavery and south to north labor transfers, and then by the civilizing wage labor. So let's quickly remind you what Magubani thought of post Bartolomé Diaz, post Vasco da Gama, but when the first FDI, the foreign direct investment, came, it was from Jan van Riebeck's Dutch East India Company. And for van Riebeck, the first kind of accumulation by dispossession was not slavery. It was extermination. He didn't want the Khoisan there. And there are lots of his quotes that'll give you a sense of just how important it was for him to clear the way so that he could set up that agricultural station for the mercantilist process. The second comes when Marx starts understanding the slave process he was watching in the United States. It had been banned in Britain and then in South Africa in the 1830s, leading to the Great Trek. But he really began to think about how that slavery that reduced the social cost of labor by not paying wages was then part of how Western labor aristocracies emerged. And that was particularly clear when Anthony Trollope came, because for him it was very important to say, well, we don't want slave black labor, and we don't want to exterminate. We need them to go deep into the mines, and that was Kimberley, the big hole. Who can doubt that work is the great civilizer of the world? And these are workers who'd been living in the wildest state of unalloyed savagery. So you can kind of get a sense now from this periodization that capital needs racism and uses racism in very different ways at different times. When our other best-known South African sociologist, Harold Wolpe, began to describe this, he hadn't really relied on capital and the non-capital using Luxembourg, but instead articulations of modes of production that he was learning from the French who were in West Africa, Claude Mayassi especially. But he came up with the thesis that cheap labor was so crucial to the way capitalism worked that there would be a continuing need to keep apartheid or some version of a formal Bantustan relationship to the supplies of labor going to mines and fields and factories. His wife, actually, Anne-Marie, did most of the hard work on identifying how this was not just a class and race and then Bantustan spatial relationship, but a gendered one through, as I mentioned, the subsidized labor that could be reproduced because women took up jobs that in a civilized capitalist society a state would. Childcare, creches, schools, medical aids, health clinics, and retirement systems. I take from this wonderful tradition a series of, let's say, explorations of partial truths. And I always take from, man, I think is the greatest of our political economists who passed away in 2018, Samir Amin, an attempt to put that into a bigger theory, the theory of dependency, which to me is a big part of uneven development. It's the north-south part. For him, the only way out of this is delinking, to find the worst roots of extraction, financial, pharmaceutical, many of the roots that we've been experiencing as we fight for AIDS medicines or COVID-19 vaccines. What did he think about this country? So I wrote an article about this late last year because I was reading through much of what I could find about how he compared apartheid-era South Africa in the world system to post-apartheid. Nothing has changed. This is his posthumous autobiography, 2019. South Africa's sub-imperialist role has been reinforced by democracy, still dominated as it is by the Anglo-American mining monopolies. Now, we've had 3 hours of the most inspiring discussions about Palestine today and solidarity. So, of course, Samir Amin would say that against Israeli genocide, really in league, in a sense, only amongst the BRICS with Iran, because the other BRICS, we can go into the reasons why, but they're simply ambiguous at best on their relationship to Israel. The other anti-imperial project Samir would have identified, he died before COVID, was when Ramaphosa and Modi went to the WTO and said, hey, we need some medicines here, some vaccines, some treatment for COVID. And you people in the West are hogging. Do you remember Justin Trudeau, the Canadian leader? We're going to have 5 vaccines available for every citizen. That was the hogging, or the degree to which the intellectual property and the wealth of the West meant we had vaccine apartheid. So that was wonderful to see Ramaphosa and Modi. Modi, obviously, because they have CIPLA, this big third world pharmacy, right, to support. But unfortunately, I'm racing through a long story. Unfortunately, what Samir Amin was describing, the mining monopolies have got a big hold on us. And it's not just mining, it's fossil fuels. Why, for example, did our SA National Defense Force put 1,200 troops into Cabo Delgado, Mozambique? It was because Emmanuel Macron visited in May 2021 and asked for it within 3 months, along with Rwanda and a few other countries. South African troops were defending Total Energies at the 3rd largest gas field in the world, in Cabo Delgado. Luckily, we didn't see too many casualties, and we don't know how many local insurgents from Islamic communities that they killed. But then they were just last month redeployed, 3,000 now, in the eastern DRC, where child labor and this global value chain of minerals is terribly exploitative. There are plenty of other ways we can talk through what a sub-imperial, not anti-imperial position looks like, particularly when it comes to supporting the IMF, the World Bank, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, where the West and the BRICS have a very strong alliance. And for Samir, the interesting question for uneven development is how you can talk left about not liking Western-dominated politics, but then you accept the geopolitics of economic neoliberalism. You walk right. This comes, by the way, from Brazil. Rui Mauro Marini was probably our greatest Brazilian dependency theorist. And he, right after the US-supported coup in 1964, was writing about the sub-imperial role of Brazil, talking about how it means collaborating actively with imperialist expansion, assuming in this expansion the position of a key nation. Now, put this in context, as Harvey did, by thinking about the big sweep of overaccumulation crisis. Now, I come to that in a second. And as I just review these, let's say, stories of how South Africa locates itself, the broad context is a failure by the Western powers to manage their overaccumulation crisis. And they have a series of what we can look at now, temporary spatio-temporal fixes. So a spatial fix moving the problem around, and a temporal fix using finance to delay dealing with the problem. And that means that you get this next layer of countries, the sub-imperial countries, that were first absorbers of all of that overaccumulated, that excess capital. And then they became competitors. And that's where sub-imperialisms began to arise in the early 2000s, as each developing center of capital accumulation seeks out its systematic spatio-temporal fix for its own surplus capital by defining its territorial spheres of influence. If you're China, that's the biggest source of this surplus. You get a Belt and Road Initiative. So let's think about very quickly the summation of this theoretical argument and then look quickly at the empirical material. Now, the sources of surplus in South Africa, I've tried to show, entail amplified super-exploitation, extreme, at the world's worst, with racial, gender, generational, geographical, and environmental features. This crisis that continues to reappear, Chris Malakani I've worked on the South African manifestation. It's overaccumulation, it's overproduction. How do you deal with it? Let me just give you 3 little tips from my own work the last period with David. Shifting, stalling, and stealing. Okay, shifting, moving the problem around, exacerbating uneven and combined geographical development, a spatial fix. You have overaccumulated capital here, and you move it over there. And then you set the conditions, like if you're in China, no free trade unions, not much in the way of the safety and health, and no environmental regulation for a long time. Stalling it is financialization. You can stall your problem by dealing with it later because you can get credit to help you buy all that overaccumulated glut of goods that have piled up. And then you steal. Now, this is where it gets exciting, I hope, because if you're from Johannesburg and you know our most famous product, it's a young lad. He was probably a wonderful kid in his youth, but he got the treatment that so many little kids get when they come up into the ruling class of Johannesburg, that is bullying. His name, Elon Musk, the richest man in the world. And the style in which accumulation by dispossession that he continues to repeat shows me that we are the most extreme site for corporate corruption. But don't take it from me. I'll show you how PwC looks at it. We might even have a chance to look at the state of the class struggle as part of this story, not one I specialize in. We've had the late, great Eddie Webster providing so much, and many others who I could go on about, who give us so many insights. Why is this interesting? Empirically, right now, or let's say last month, the finance minister in the US named Janet Yellen visited Xi Jinping and her finance counterpart and said, "You've got too much overaccumulation." Okay, her word is overcapacity. Now, that's a very interesting problem, because when Xi Jinping on Monday went to Paris, there's von der Leyen and there's Macron. Hey, we don't have overaccumulation. Well, actually you do, especially all the data show, and even Chinese companies will agree, that there is a relatively limited demand in China for this vast output of the different components of solar. The modules, the cells, the wafers, the polysilicon. And so they're producing nearly 90% of the world's supply of these things. They've also invested massively, as you see, in robots. So the really advanced capital goods drive overproduction. They're much more productive than having, sweatshops. So this robotization is another part of the underlying crisis. And you can see some of the crisis emerge in this new burst, the last few years, of a manufacturing export capacity that we thought China had managed because they were investing much more in their own local infrastructure. Another indicator is that the bank loans in China used to be, you see the darker line, was for the real estate industry, the developers. And you see how they overaccumulated there. Way too many empty buildings and ghost cities. And so there's very little, in fact, negative loans that go to the developers, and you see the huge rise in manufacturing. Now, this is terribly important for us because we're about to lose, they say, ArcelorMittal, 2 major foundries, including the big one in Newcastle, because of the import of cheap Chinese steel. It's massively overaccumulated. And look at a formerly very balanced industrial economy, 24%, and now deindustrialization. And you can really tap into the data on where is that deindustrialization, where's the competition, or where's the excessive capital investment? And unfortunately, look how bad, how extreme South Africa has become in losing jobs in clothing and textiles and leather. 15% of those jobs net have lost, and you can see compared to our peer groups, that's just very, very tragic. Part of this is the reinvestment doesn't happen to keep up with the competition because there's overproduction everywhere. But it's also because we have a problem. We have a very corrupt group of people in Sandton, in Rosebank, Umhlanga, Stellenbosch, Cape Town. 8 out of 10 managers commit economic crime. We're the world fraud champs in money laundering, bribery and corruption, procurement fraud, asset misappropriation, cybercrime. Do you think it's a Marxist who's saying this? No, it's PwC. Now, Transparency International will give us our ratings. You look at it and you kind of say, oh, Cyril Ramaphosa let the team down. We were the 110th most corrupt out of 180 countries, so very much in the bottom range. But this year we've gone up to 100th. But it's really in the corporate side, and the last rankings put us tied with China behind India as number 1. But again, it's crucial to look at who's doing it, because it is a problem of race and class. And let me use a little French. This is an unpatriotic bourgeoisie that we're having to deal with. The involvement of senior management as the main perpetrator of these crimes had soared the last time they did it. I think I'm at nearly 40 minutes or more. I need to give you some antidotes because this is such a depressing scenario of all the different things I consider contributors to extreme uneven development. The financialization, I could go on about all the morbid symptoms of our financial markets. I mean, we were all just gray listed a year ago, right? I mean, to me that was good because finally the Reserve Bank and the Treasury, full of slackers, can start regulating. They say, hey, we need to regulate these things now. And we have so many other examples of the looting of our natural wealth and the pollution that provides huge costs locally among the worst sites in the world for sulfur dioxide. And nitrous oxide is just east of here in Mpumalanga. And CO2 emissions. We rank number 3rd in the world per unit of GDP per person after Kazakhstan and the Czech Republic. So it's extreme. But this is an extremely good story. So just give me a second to remind you that in a meeting of this sort 20 years ago, we'd be lamenting that we can't get the AIDS medicines. But actually around about 2004, because of all these different things that were happening around the world, and especially leaders like these ones, Zaki Ahmed and one of my PhD students at UKZN, Vuyiseka Debula, due to government denialism and pharmaceutical greed, the poor were sent home to die, while those who could afford to buy antiretrovirals in the private sector were able to live. The size of your pocket determined whether you lived or died. Uneven development in the extreme in such a vital area where 5 million, 20 years ago, 5 million of our compatriots were living with HIV. And what leadership, right, from Vuyiseka and Zaki, because they did continuing critiques of the ways in which we had a sub-imperial relationship in the government with big pharma corps. And then, because they broke through with alliances that included ACT UP and Médecins Sans Frontières and Oxfam and AIDS support groups all over the world, they broke through in 2001 to get an intellectual property exemption, but then finally pushing and pulling against the Trade Minister Alec Irwin, the Health Minister Mantu Chabalala Msamang, and President Mbeki. And finally, we got these 5 million public sector recipients. It's now 7 million. There was a dip down during COVID-19. Some of the ability to maintain the regimes was limited. But I think these lessons are really crucial. I mean, I'll show you as the last slide now, the life expectancy. It's soared. But also, this is the hope, isn't it? Although it's a single issue, and I talk in the end of the paper about the need to go beyond NGO silo politics. NGO, in the sense, you're specialized and you have, some advocacy work here, and maybe you have a community group that can do protests there. But to find ways to transcend that. But here is this example. instead of taking intellectual property as a given, which, by the way, is so crucial to the 4IR, isn't it? This is a real fourth industrial counter-revolution that I have such respect for, don't you? To make a commons out of something that's a global public good, to decommodify it, make it free, to de-stratify it. Wealthy people can go into public clinics and get free ARVs. To de-globalize capital. It's not just in New Jersey and Switzerland you can make these. You can make them in Midrand and Gqeberha, Harare, Kampala, and to globalize solidarity. And this is the inspiring chart I will leave you with, to contest uneven development of corporate power and public health. Look at that incredible increase after having gone down to 53, up again just before COVID to 66. To me, this is the socializing and decommodifying approach that so many South Africans. I think I forgot one tiny point about Hilda Nkantini, because she represents the jiu-jitsu capacity. She was very much won over by AJ Banga, except for two things. Did you see, she was looking, yeah, this MasterCard, this will help me. I don't have to stand in queues and get ripped off by Tsotsis. But what AJ Banga and his team wanted was to give her debit orders, and also to say, but we also need your biometrics. Would you give us a fingerprint, please? So what did Hilda say? All my friends have gotten these damn debit orders. We're not going to take debit orders. No, thank you. We'll just take the cash, and then we'll deal with our finances, not through financialized systems. And that finger, I don't want any Tsotsi to think they can take my finger, so you're not going to get my biometrics. I think that's the spirit of a South African that can contest uneven development in the extreme. And I hope you all have your own vignettes when you think about it, because the world desperately needs these ideas. Not necessarily the deep theory, but how to do praxis epistemology, how to understand a change in power relations that come from these extremely important and fascinating and sometimes tragic struggles. Thank you very much. And a real guru of the topic of uneven development, Sam Ashman. Thanks.
Well, what can I say? It's a pleasure and an honour for me to do this. But you'll also, I'm sure, be thinking, how on earth does one respond in 7 minutes to a talk of such great range and power? The only way one can do it is by being highly selective. Highly selective. So I've got 3 basic points. But before I get to the three basic points, it's almost impossible not to want to say something about the sheer energy of Patrick. The sheer and utter, I mean, the amount that he writes. And it's not simply that he is so prolific, it's also the amount of things that he does as well as writing all those things that he writes. And he's not fossil fueled, but I want to know on what he is fueled, by what he is fueled, because I would like a little bit myself. And also, before I get to my 3 points, he did in an email, on one of his email lists, you know his email lists that go out to who knows how many people across the globe that get these emails. Who knows? He did on one of his recent emails say that he thought that he and I agreed about 95% on things. Okay, so I pretty much agree with it, but I've decided that the 5% must be left for the bit in there, okay? The bit with the room with the drinks, or the bit with the room with the chat. That's where we talk about the 5%. Right now, I don't care about the 5%, frankly, not a bit. So the three points I want to make are really why I think I and everybody here should regard Patrick as an exemplary scholar. They're the things I want to talk about. So, and the first one is because he has the courage to have a big vision and a big picture and attempt to get to grips with what we sometimes call the totality. And we are trained in academic work to do the precise opposite.
because we're all in our little silos, we're all trying to make our own individual contribution, we're all trying to find a little gap in the literature, we're all trying to devise a research, a practical, realizable research project, we're all trying to write a funding project a proposal that somebody's going to fund. We're all trying to do that. And we need some people in the world and in academia who say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stand back and I'm going to look at how all this absolute horror and nonsense works and fits together. And that to me is extremely important, because it's different in a sense, because it's about joining the dots. It's not about the polycrisis. Now, I really like the ideas that are very popular about the polycrisis. And I really like Adam Tooze, don't get me wrong. And I actually really like seeing Adam Tooze writing about the students in Colombia and supporting the students in Colombia in their solidarity actions with Gaza. And, sometimes an active liberal is far better than an armchair Marxist, all right? So that's me just nailing a few colours to whatever is out there to be nailed. But Patrick's approach is not the polycrisis, because it's trying to say there are causal dynamics. We need a big picture, but we also need to try and identify what are the causal dynamics, what are the causal mechanisms and tendencies. So that's point number one. Point number two, I think, is the connection between theory and changing reality. So as we saw in the talk, clearly there's an enormous influence of Marx, of Luxemburg, of David Harvey, of Bernard Magabani, of Samir Amin, of great thinkers. And that's important. And they're not all dead white men with beards, of course. But that's important. It's important to say that there are these historical contributions which are still relevant to understanding the world today. But the world changes. And so, what can we take from them that's relevant, and where do we need to move on? This is not about having things set in stone, carved to be repeated as dogma over and over again. And so there's got to be creativity and engagement with new realities. And I think that's why it's very important that Patrick has done work and others have done work on financialization and the way that the changing webs of finance have changed patterns of exploitation, they've changed patterns of integration, and they've amplified South Africa's combined and uneven development in very, 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 very specific and horrific ways. And I also like, in painting the big picture, about the way that South Africa has accepted, and the South African state, the government, has accepted and embraced the neoliberalized, globalized, financialized realities, that these are key and critical to explaining state capture. That state capture is not simply something which is separate from this terrain and is something which is about, individual nastiness or so on. It's about patterns of class formation and patterns of accumulation and the way in which other avenues have been systematically blocked. And so all these huge things that we've heard about today are actually really important for understanding why we are surrounded by crumbling infrastructure, and you feel that Johannesburg is falling apart, and we have load shedding and so on and so on. So that's my point number two. My final point three about why I think we should all regard Patrick as an exemplary scholar is about the connection between theory and practice. Patrick talks about how he's got a sort of top-down meets bottom-up approach, which I like, and I think he's good. But there's another element of that, and I think it's an important element of Patrick, is that actually he goes out and he does stuff. Okay, I'm talking about theory and practice in the practice of actually you do something, and that practice informs who you are, and how you write about things, and how you look about things, and how you behave, and how you engage, and how you interact with the world. So it's not simply that he writes really good articles and things online. He's constantly seeking to amplify the voices of the poor, but he's actually tirelessly and sort of indefatigably out there doing it. So, you know, you hear him on the radio, you know, there's something about Johannesburg water crises and Patrick's there, and then you realise actually Patrick organised it. Or, you know, Standard Bank, highlighting Standard Bank's continuing investment in fossil fuels. He's not just writing about it, he's actually outside Standard Bank. I don't think he got arrested, but he, you know, he's there with the people who did get arrested, because he's saying that these are the people who are killing the planet and who are killing human and non-human life simultaneously. So Patrick is there, and I think in that way he sets an example for us all. And I think I would personally like to say, and I suspect I would like to say it on behalf of everybody, that really all we want to say to you, Patrick, is thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Sarah.
Absolutely fine. You have. Here we are. Good, good. And the hat. Yeah, the left. Okay. Yep. Right. Sorry. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Prof. Ashman. You know, I was actually thinking while he was talking, how does one respond to that? But you've done extremely well in responding. So thank you very much. You know, at the beginning, Prof. Naidu said when she read the CV, she hoped she can do justice to the incredible dynamic legacy of Prof. Bond. And today we saw it in action. And we saw a rich tapestry of thinking and work over many years. And that has indeed been a wonderful privilege. It has been a thought-provoking presentation. And now I look forward to reading the paper. Haven't done it yet, confession, but I think I have been stimulated to learn more and to read more and to delve deeply into the thoughts that you shared with us today. So thank you very much for that. And colleagues, I think you saw why Prof. Bond is not only a professor, but a distinguished professor at UJ. And again, that was demonstrated for us tonight. And I absolutely agree that we saw an exemplary scholar in action. So thank you very much for that. Earlier today, this afternoon, when I spoke to you, you said, and you also mentioned it here, I think, that you are happy that you have joined UJ. Now, I can tell you we are very happy that you've joined UJ, and we are very happy that you are happy that you've joined UJ. So thank you very, very much. It was a very enriching talk, quite dense, because there was a lot. But I hope that serves as an inspiration for us all to now go and read it. So congratulations, Prof. Bond, with this inaugural lecture, UJ inaugural lecture this evening. And we now invite you, please, to join Prof. Bond and have a nice champagne, if you wish, or wine, or whatever you wish to celebrate this evening and to continue with the conversation that started now. All of the best. Thank you very much.